And this graph here is interesting. This show is called Epiphany TV. I play YouTube videos. I play Baldur's Gate. I play VR sometimes. I listen to music. A lot of times I listen to stuff that's like about consciousness expanding kind of stuff, or liberation based political things, all sorts of stuff. Stay tuned. This is the intro.
Go.
What Lacan calls the elementary cell of the graph desire, graph 1. And we have 4 points. Our starting point is this little triangle here, and the trajectory takes us through to the barred S, Lacan's symbol for the subject. The subject is not the individual, not the person, not the ego, but it is human subjectivity. And we should hear in this term subject the implication subject to. This is why Lacan describes the subject as a function. Lacan makes it clear that we're not talking about the subject of psychology. Lacan takes a pretty dim view of psychology, calling psychologists Philistines, referring to its lowly purpose of social exploitation, and most cuttingly saying that psychologists just do a judicial astrology. What's wrong with psychology is its criterion is the unity of the subject, he says. Hence why the subject here, S, has a bar through it. Lacan's dismal view of psychology is repeated throughout his work. And on lacanonline.com, you can read more in my article, What Does Psychoanalysis Have to Do with Psychology? Here, in Subversion of the Subject, alongside criticisms of psychology, Lacan throws in criticisms of the reduction of subjectivity to consciousness or states of consciousness, even if they are higher forms of consciousness like the degrees of samadhi in Buddhism, the trips and highs of hallucinogenic drugs, or the states of enthusiasm described by Plato. Lacan's point, in short, is that no matter how much you meditate, you're still going to be a divided subject. What are you divided by? In short, by the effect of the signifier, denoted here by S.
I just want to talk for a second. I do practice meditation and various forms of ritual and various forms of consciousness expanding experiences. And some of the things that I post that I'm going to show on this channel are going to contradict each other. But I think it's where it takes us in understanding the non-material aspects of life, the mental aspects of life, if you will, which are material in a certain way, but I think you know what I'm saying, the non-physical aspects. So I just want to clarify that right off the bat.
If you want to know more about the effect of the signifier, check out my videos on what's so unconscious about the unconscious and my series on repression. Here I'm going to flash up some quotations from Lacan for those who appreciate the references to illustrate how fundamental the effect of the signifier is in the construction of human subjectivity. But in short, we can say that a signifier is a linguistic unit, a fragment of language. A signifier can be a word or part of a word, but one which is unhinged from any particular meaning, any fixed representational reference, and which thereby refers only to other signifiers, denoted here by S', rather than to a particular meaning or signification. This assemblage of signifiers, taken together as a structure, is a key component in language. language as a formal structure rather than any particular language like English or French. As a whole, this is sometimes loosely referred to as the symbolic register, or the symbolic order. Lacan is saying that from the very start of our lives, indeed even before our births, we are fucked by the symbolic. And once you're fucked, you can't get unfucked. So notice that in the graph, this elementary cell of the graph, we begin with the barred subject. There is no entry point into language. You are already conditioned by language. Notice also here how the barred subject sits between two signifiers, in effect suspended in the gap between these S and S prime. This is why Lacan says that the signifier represents the subject for another signifier, in the same way that a lawyer represents her client for another lawyer, or an ambassador represents her country for another ambassador. Lacan's suggestion is that Freud had some intuition about this when he described how the unconscious worked. Before the arrival of modern linguistic theory, Freud talked about a primary psychical process which was characterized by two mechanisms: condensation and displacement. Lacan aligns these to two linguistic mechanisms, metaphor and metonymy. In other words, he says, the effect of the substitution and combination of signifiers in the synchronic and diachronic dimensions, respectively, in which they appear in discourse. The lesson to be drawn from the book-length studies that Freud wrote on dreams, slips of the tongue and jokes is that these all show how unconscious processes are at work which exhibit these same essentially linguistic mechanisms. Hence Lacan's most well-known maxim, the unconscious is structured like a language. The unconscious is therefore a totally different form of psychical reality to consciousness. The unconscious is not a non-consciousness, not the negation of consciousness as he refers to it here. Consciousness, he says, is obsolete to us in grounding the unconscious. What kind of subject do we mean then by subject of a linguistic unconscious? Lacan makes a distinction here between the subject of the statement and the subject of the enunciation. What do I mean when I...
This is pretty heady and it's gonna be pretty long, it seems. So I'm gonna go to the next video in this particular playlist. I don't want to. This is more sort of practical, I would imagine. It's almost the exact opposite.
Namaste.
Yeah, namaskaram, good morning.
Yes, sir. Good morning. My name is Sunil Thakkar. I'm from Masala Radio in Houston. And you must be excited about your first visit to Houston.
About excitement. Excitement about what? A 10-gallon hat? I won't fit into it.
Oh, yeah, the big Texas hat. You know what? We're looking forward to seeing you here.
Texas.
I've seen that wherever you go in the world, a lot of people gather, and we're seeing a lot of that activity here already before you come. Volunteers from all over the US have camped out here, passionately spreading the word about Sadhguru. So what is all this effort about, and what are you trying to create in the world?
See, one thing we have to realize as a generation of people is, for the first time, for the very first time in the history of humanity, we have the necessary resource, capability and technology to address every issue on the planet of nourishment, health, education, well-being, you name it. For the first time, we are capable of that. The only thing that's missing is human consciousness. And that is something that's not been worked at. Everything is in place, but the human being is not in place. So the whole effort is to raise human consciousness in such a way, to bring human beings to such a state of inclusiveness that the opportunity and possibility that we are as a generation of people doesn't pass us. It's my wish, it's my intention that we as a generation of people should not let this opportunity pass by, because we are for the first time, for the very first time in the history of humanity, are capable of things that no other generation was ever capable of. But we are not in place. So the only thing that needs to happen is, if human beings get into the right space within themselves, every other solution is right at hand.
I like it. I like what you say. You know, just looking at, comparing my situation here and you there, I'm in a closed studio, closed room, and you're out there in the open. I just heard
I'm sitting next to the rainforest.
I heard some birds in the background, and I was looking at the video initially, and looks like you're in a beautiful setting out there, Sadhguru.
Yeah, when you hear the elephant tell me, I will like to move.
Interesting. So, Sadhguru, nowadays on TV, there are more channels about spirituality and spiritual channels than there are Bollywood channels on TV now. You think people are all of a sudden becoming more spiritual and looking for spirituality?
People have always been looking for it. If you look back on the history of humanity, from the earliest times, human beings, the nature of human intelligence is such that it will never be fulfilled with just taking care of the survival process. The nature of human intelligence would always like to inquire into more profound dimensions of who I am and what is the nature of my existence, these kind of things. So it is not new, it is just that the commercial channels are beginning to realize that there's a phenomenal interest in this area. So because they are beginning to realize, lot of entrepreneurs are pretending to be spiritual, and so they're filling the content with all kinds of stuff. But essentially, it is commerce realizing that there is a spiritual thread in the world which is very phenomenally strong, and it's there in every human being, and somewhere there is an interest in everyone, whether they think so or they don't think so. The nature of human intelligence is that you are interested in knowing what is the nature of your existence.
You were talking about who am I, and I often wonder about that. Who am I? Am I, or are we as a human race just a freak accident in nature? Are we planted here? 14 billion years go by after the Big Bang, and all of a sudden here we are. Are we the only people in the cosmos?
So, Lacan, to tie this together for a second, would say that there is no you below all of that. That there is no you. Like, there was this part of your life called the mirror phase, where you thirsted and hunger. You had thirst and you were hungry, but you didn't think of it that way. You just thirsted and hungered, and your needs were met. Eventually, when you cried, a warm entity would come to you and feed you. Eventually, you recognized I as a subject, the you, and you became aware of the self, the ego, which is the initial illness. It can become a trauma in a way, in and of itself. It is, that Lacan would say, and that celebrity culture and consumerism really push you to fulfill that desire, right? And they present a fulfilled desire in the form of celebrity. But everyone has a hole, a lack, and we're all trying to get the desire of others to fulfill that hole, but you can't fulfill a negation with a negation. So that's part of it. We'll probably watch some Peter Rollins later, and he goes into it a lot. I think it is practical. I think it can be very practical. It's oftentimes you don't see the practicality of something until you've been in a situation where that practicality becomes necessary. And then it's like, whoa, this is the kind of stuff people need, because you think, that you have the ideas of like what technically can work, what physically can work, what, we can feed people by developing programs that meet their material need on mass scale. It's simple as just a mind switch. We could buy, we could network with their communities, our neighborhoods, and buy at a cheaper rate food, and use that money we save to buy, solar panels And then with those solar panels, we could get energy and actually make money from the grid and use that money to start our own community enterprises and become autonomous neighborhood by neighborhood. But how do you go and talk to the people? What happens when you're 10 people, 12 people in and there's drama? What happens when... So there's all these things that are much more that you think, oh, well, we don't need that. We just need to like get 70 people together and take over, whatever, like that kind of thing. But that's the end, or, that may or may not even need to happen, but that would be something that wouldn't even be able to happen until we get ourselves right in a certain way. The Swarages in India, they have 7 million people in a very anarchist area. The people in Rojava have 2 million people there. But it's didn't come about through the mindsets we use to engage with each other in the West. I don't think. And it won't. It can't. And that's why I think we have to focus on these other aspects.
You want to know who you are?
I don't know who I am.
Don't ask such questions on the public channel. People will send you to the psychiatry ward if you go and ask somebody who I am. This is a question that you should direct to yourself. If you ask somebody else, they will tell you something. Now whatever I tell you, you're asking the question invariably because there is no experience of who you are. So if I tell you something, you have only 2 options. You can either believe me or disbelieve me. If I tell you you are a drop of whatever, the creator, you can believe me or disbelieve me. Right now, if you're sitting in the comfort of your studio, you'll believe me, and tomorrow when you drive out and if there is an issue or problem, you will disbelieve me, or it'll vary in so many different ways. If you believe me, you will not get any closer to reality. If you disbelieve me, you will not get any closer to reality. If you want to know, a seeking has to happen. So it is good, you have taken the first step, that is to realize that I do not even know who I am or what is the nature of my existence. Just deepen this. The pain of ignorance should tear you apart. When that happens, the seeking will flare up in such a way, knowing is just one moment away. Because what you're seeking is not sitting on top of Himalayas, it's within you. There is no distance, it's only a question of creating a certain priority.
You've also not read the Gita. You ride motorcycles, you race cars, you fly helicopters, enjoy dancing. So what are you, Sadhguru? Are you a new age yogi, a modern mystic, a super sadhu?
What you need to realize is, always if you look back on the history of, let's say, our culture here, or anywhere in the world, realized beings, yogis, mystics, lived extraordinary lives. They sang, most of the sages and saints of this land are singing saints, they sang, they danced, whatever was available to them, they celebrated their life in its fullest possible way. It is just that a Gautam Buddha did not have a motorcycle. Adi Yogi did not have a helicopter to fly. Unfortunately, it was a technological failure. It is not that they were not capable of that. So, am I new age or old age? No, I'm just contemporary. And always, yogis and mystics have been absolutely contemporary and relevant to the times in which they existed. Right now, this question is coming because there are a lot of people who are essentially entrepreneurs who have shaped themselves, who project themselves, who dress and live like they came out of a calendar art. Their idea of a yogi is a calendar, that they're looking at a calendar picture of some B-grade artist who wrote the picture of a yogi or drew the picture of a yogi. They're trying to craft themselves like that. And that is because this is all picked up from outside, bits and pieces. They read somewhere, this is how Shiva was dressed, so they're trying to dress like that. It'll be weird for you to dress how people dressed 20,000 years ago, you want to dress like that today. You dress the way it is today, and you live the way it is today, because they all lived the way it was on that day. So always yogis and mystics have been contemporary, and I am contemporary too. I am neither old age nor new age, relevant to the times in which you exist. If you are not relevant to the times in which you exist, you should have been in a museum or an archive, not living in the society.
You know, you mentioned the journey inwards, and it's very hard for me to fathom what that really is. I've heard that before. That's the ultimate journey. The space is not where you want to go, it's within you. But where? How do I look? How do I turn my eyes to the back of my head and see down my throat and down my esophagus? Where is it? Where am I looking? And how far do I have to go?
See, inward does not mean contemplation. Inward does not mean dissection. When we say inward, I want you to, in this brief time it's difficult to even attempt this, but I want you to understand this much. What you call as my body, you accumulated over a period of time, isn't it? Yes?
Yes.
It is an accumulation. What you call as my mind or is an accumulation of impressions. What you call as body is accumulation of the food that you've eaten, and what you call as my mind is accumulation of impressions that you have taken in. So these two accumulations, these two heaps, a heap of food and a heap of impressions, are yours. Whatever you accumulate can be yours, but can never ever be you, isn't it? So, if you know how to keep what you have accumulated aside, what you are will stand up and glow. It's a very simple process.
Sadhguru, it's so hard to find. I'm in the radio business, and I try and find volunteers and employees, and it's hard to find good employees. How are you able to attract so many amazing volunteers? There are a few right here who are devoting all their time, their energy to Isha.
If you are doing what everybody wants, if your life is about everybody's well-being, why will people not be there? If you are trying to extract something from them, they will run away. If you are always seeing how to offer something to them, they will be there. I should tell you this. Some time ago, I was doing a 3-day event for the top 30 executives of a multinational company in India. And then when we were doing this, these are companies which are always having attrition problems, and they are also trying to continuously steal somebody from somewhere else. That is the way they get their people. And as it was going through, and we had about 8-9 volunteers who were running around and doing everything with absolute commitment and precision. So they asked me, these are like really top executives. These are companies which have over like close to 500,000 employees. And they asked…
So I just wanted to say real quick, we will be playing some VR later on. We'll play some Baldur's Gate. A lot of times this is just gonna be an 8-hour channel. Like I'm just gonna play 8-hour playlists, and I'll be in and out. I'm just gonna leave it running and shit while I do stuff. But other times I'll be in. So feel free to jump in and engage. I have my chat open. I can always check it out on my phone or on my laptop that I bring with me if I'm out. I'll be monitoring it occasionally. And there'll be times while I'm on. I'm gonna try it this way. I got 24 viewers last time I did this. That's more than I've gotten on any stream, and so I figure make it like kind of like a TV channel, and this is what it's called. It's called channel on Twitch. So, but until I get affiliate, there's no commercials. So enjoy that. I have YouTube Premium. So hopefully I can share to y'all some wisdom that you may agree with, you may not. It's okay. That's not really the point. I don't think. I think that our modern society makes us just jump into camps so easily. Like, I have to either disagree or agree with this information. No, you can just take it, and one day it may be useful. And just even for a conversation starter, you never know. You never know. That's like when you when you have some sort of, when you follow the lack, when you follow what you don't have in a way that's, when you follow a certain direction, like a definite goal point, and you put that whatever you don't have into that goal point, thinking it will fulfill you, or thinking that's the only thing, you get distracted. You see every opportunity that doesn't lead directly in that direction as a distraction, and you lose the ability to be spontaneous with what's around you, or to look for already existing circumstances with which to work, as opposed to and then you try to copy instead of you try to use and utilize instead of experience. It's important to experience, because then organic things happen that you couldn't have manifested.
Guru, where do you get these people? I told them, you don't get them, you have to make them. So they asked, how do you make them? So I told them, you have to make them fall in love with you. Then they asked, how do you do that? I said, first of all, you have to fall in love with them. Then they said, oh, they don't pay us for that. So, if that's the way it is, people are hard to come by, but there are 7 billion people. Why is it that we are not looking at what can we do that all of them want? If we do what everybody wants deep within himself, always people will pitch for it and make it happen. So this is the whole thing about Isha. Isha is 100% volunteer organization, because Isha is not about an organization, Isha is about the people.
You know, you talk about knowing people and what they want. If you ever made a Bollywood movie, Sadhguru, it'd be a big hit.
If you show somebody a Bollywood movie, it'll entertain them only for an evening. If you show 3 movies in a day, they will get bored. If they see 5 movies in a day, probably they'll get sick, okay? So, Bollywood movie is a distraction for people from whatever they're doing, the boredom and the repetitiveness of their life. They want to see something entertaining. But what I'm offering is not an entertainment, it's a transformative process, and it's a challenge for every human being. It is not about continuing the way they are with a little bit of entertainment in their life. It is about transforming themselves to a new possibility. So, I don't think they can even be compared. So if I'm given a role, will I play in a Bollywood movie? Well, my life is more action-packed than Bollywood movies on a daily basis, so I don't think it'll interest me.
Sadhguru, we welcome you to Houston. It's 1 month away. Looking forward to seeing you in Houston. What is your message for everybody in Houston?
I'm not a messenger. I don't carry any message. I don't carry any philosophy or teaching. Or have I come to give you a belief system or a dogma. My effort is to bring a technology for your well-being. Today, there are various technologies to bring external well-being. Because of these technologies, human life has become more comfortable and convenient than ever before. As a generation of people, we are the most comfortable generation ever. But we cannot say we are the most joyful generation, we cannot say we are the most peaceful generation or loving generation, because we have taken care of the external technologies. We have not made use of the inner technologies. So I am coming to Houston to offer this dimension. Offer this dimension in utmost purity and the way it works. Technology for inner well-being, technologies for inner well-being, so that technology essentially means that doing things the way it works, not doing things the way you believe it is, doing things the way it works, that is technology. Technology is non-discriminatory. You may be anybody, you may be a man, you may be a woman, you may be a Hindu, Christian, Muslim, whatever, you may be an American or an Indian, it doesn't matter who you are. When it comes to technology, you just have to learn how to do it, and it works for you. So, right now you see millions of people busily engaged with their iPhones and iPads, but I'm asking you, what about the eye? This is the greatest gadget. This human being is the most sophisticated piece of machinery and technology. If you learn to empower this, if you learn to operate this in its full depth and dimension, you will live your life magically, not miserably. So this is my offer to everybody, not just in Houston, everybody anywhere in the world. This is my offer that it is time that you learn to operate your well-being in a scientific manner, not with all kinds of weird belief systems. Thank you very much.
शरीरं सुरूपं यथा वा कलत्रं यशश्चारुचित्रं धनं मेरुतुल्यं गुरोरं
योगेश्वर
Wicca
Our suffering as a species comes from the incorrect perception of living in the past through our attachment to memories that then shape our future. The phantoms of past and future are only of use to the intellect because it gives individuals the idea that they are in control of their lives. Yet as an individual grows, he begins to understand that no matter how grandiose his attempts at control, life always has a way of changing those plans. And in doing so, life also destroys the individual's imagined ability to control the future outcome. This mentality of forcing ourselves upon life is a socially accepted practice of modern civilization. An individual's attempt to control life according to her own beliefs, and as a result to force this perspective upon others, is the beginning of tyranny. Lao Tzu's essential teaching of Wu Wei, on the other hand, illustrates the futility of our attempts to control life. He emphasizes that it is only when you give up forcing or controlling anything that you begin to get the kind of control you always wanted, but never knew existed. The Taoism of Lao Tzu was about the way, the Tao, which is something we experience when we are more attentive to our inner and outer worlds. The Tao can be followed and experientially known when we have surrendered our control, conditioned identity over to the effortless realm of spontaneity and trust, Wu Wei. Translated into English, Wu Wei means non-doing, non-action, or effortless action. These translations are literally correct and lead us to the intuitive and ultimate psychological experience of Wu Wei. This effortless psychological experience means not forcing or allowing a state of intelligent spontaneity. This effortless realm is why the Tao is usually referred to as the way of nature, because when we follow the way, we can experience the same spontaneity of nature within our own experience. As a result, we trust our path through life. The discovery of this spontaneity in life allows us to sink deeply into the awareness that we are nature and not separate from any aspect of it. The essential teaching of Wu-Wei can only be known if the individual is sincere in surrendering control and, as a result, giving his life over to something much bigger than himself. Tao is that which is bigger than our personal lives. Its depth of understanding is vast. Wu-Wei is the fragrance of Tao. It is the spiritual attitude that is expressed and lived by many adepts, gurus, masters, saints, sages, shamans, and yogis. When we discover the flow of Tao moving within our own lives, as a sage does, we begin to be receptive to where our experience in life is leading us. We cease clinging to the experiences of the past and instead become rejuvenated in the present. The future becomes nothing more than a mirage, as the pure transparency and reflectivity of our consciousness begins to be absorbed in the feminine womb of the Tao. When you don't force yourself upon life, you discover that you are life. All our vain attempts to control life result from the way we are raised, because our culture and society influence us to believe that we do not belong to the world. We are taught to feel like aliens in this world, like in a great cosmic joke with no punchline. We are raised to believe that we exist in a hostile universe, so we ought to fear one another and never trust anyone. This ideology is bringing the human race to its knees. At the rate of speed that we are polarizing ourselves, it is hard to imagine there will be any remnants of higher, conscious life on this planet 1,000 years from now. Our lack of trust is destroying our civilization and also causing a huge dent in the animal, plant, and mineral kingdoms. This type of neurosis has gotten to the point that on an individual level, we do not even trust our own psychological states. We do not act authentically, and we confuse our identity with our social identity. In mere shadows of who we are, we cause violence towards others, condemn anyone who opposes our opinion, and hypnotically hurt those we love. All of this is done in the name of force and control. Social and cultural norms teach us this dichotomy. To act or function any other way is, from the point of view of the status quo, absurd. Government, organized religion, society, and culture mark the physical advent of the trust that is lacking within the individual. If individuals lose their natural essence of trust, then some form of external tyranny in the guise of a trustworthy parental figure will take its place. Individuals fail to trust themselves, and this is why a lot of people ignorantly trust their government without question. In giving our power away to government, the individual begins to depend on the government as a parent rather than seeing it in its original position, as a servant to the individual. Our lack of responsibility implies our lack of trust in ourselves. Government is a phantom into which we invest too much energy. Individuals who sincerely trust themselves and others threaten the established order of culture, society, organized religion, and government. This threat could only become a reality if the truth of Tao is regained and a trust in life is realized. Wu-Wei is the Taoist principle of trust. The trust of Wu-Wei threatens any governmental, social, religious, and cultural landscape. We align with our innate trust when we are not forcing and instead allow life to take place. This capacity to align with your innate trust brings you back in harmony with the entire unfolding of the cosmos. To go with the grain or with a stream, one is not bound to the past, nor does one yearn for the future. We cannot unite with the source of Tao unless we have given our life over to the non-doing, non-forcing, and non-reactive realm of Wu-Wei. Lao Tzu's essential wisdom is nothing more than that of an individual who can follow the effortless grace of Wu-Wei within her mind. Everything else that has developed around Lao Tzu's essential wisdom is a way either to get to the understanding of Wu-Wei or to delay our enlightenment through habitual crutches that take the form of spiritual exercises and practices. From the perspective of the ancient masters Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, enlightenment can only be realized in the ability to live Wu-Wei. The practice of Wu-Wei is the vehicle we use to realize our innate freedom. The Taoism of Lao Tzu emphasizes that if we do not let individuals grow as nature intended, they will lose their naturalness and be drawn into the world of animal drives, desires, attachments, and ultimately suffering. This difference in the depth of understanding between Lao Tzu and Confucius.
So I think this is another part where it kind of gets into like the Lacanian, like it's interesting just how things, we're studying these things and they obviously have parallels but this is thousands of years old. It's just we're coming to conclusions through the certain methods that are really powerful and indeed done great things, but some of the conclusions we're coming to were already there and were found through experiential data, which doesn't hold up in a laboratory, and nor should it. But at the same time, they could be funded in a certain way, but it doesn't lead to profits. So there's no reason why a college program that doesn't lead to profits would get the kind of funding that a college program that would lead to profits would. A college program that taught us not to try to fulfill the lack would undermine consumerism entirely and could bring down the economic system. So why would they want to fund that kind of program? That's ridiculous.
Is articulated.
Not to say people can't get grants. I'm not trying to say don't try. I mean, I'm just saying there's a reason why it hasn't happened as of yet.
In an imaginary dialogue created by Zhuangzi. Tell me, said Lao Tzu, in what consists charity and duty to one's neighbor? They consist, answered Confucius, in a capacity for rejoicing in all things, in universal love, without the element of self. These are the characteristics of charity and duty to one's neighbor. What stuff? Cried Lao Tzu. Does not universal love contradict itself? Is not your elimination of self a positive manifestation of self? Sir, if you would cause the empire not to lose its source of nourishment, there is the universe, its regularity is unceasing. There are the sun and the moon, their brightness is unceasing. There are the stars, their groupings never change. There are the birds and beasts, they flock together without varying. There are the trees and shrubs, they grow upwards without exception. Be like these, follow Tao, and you will be perfect. Why then these vain struggles after charity and duty to one's neighbour, as though beating a drum in search of a fugitive? Alas, sir, you have brought much confusion into the mind of man. In this imaginary dialogue, Lao Tzu reiterates that if we interfere in the natural process of any living organism, it will begin to isolate itself from the complementary parts of the whole. This isolation brings about a dissociation from the whole, so that a lack of trust plagues the mind. Confucius's idea of charity and duty to one's neighbour are age-old teachings, which artists, philosophers, and spiritual teachers have contemplated from the dawn of civilization to the present day. On the surface, we may feel convinced that he is correct in postulating that we have a duty to others. But the Taoist way of Lao Tzu suggests that in attempting to interfere with others' affairs, no matter how large or small, we are assuming that the natural experience of life is not happening spontaneously. Instead, we think that life is a series of controlled steps following a predictable and mechanical process. Lao Tzu is not saying that we should abolish duty or charity. He is saying that everything in the universe is integral and symbiotic in nature, and that everything functions harmoniously according to the rhythm of the universe. So he asks, why would humanity be the exception? The way of the Tao and our experience of it comes from allowing all aspects of the universe to happen as they will without conscious interference. This understanding of the Tao is a trust in and affirmation of life that cannot be broken. Humanity's superficial differences could be dissolved if each individual could live by this trust. Yet society and culture have been built on ideologies such as Confucianism, communism, and democracy, which all teach us in some way to impose our will over one another, a goal.
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree with this guy's points on some of these things, obviously. I think that the Tao can be used by anarchists and left-wing people who I think would be down to remove the obstructions that have disallowed us to work on the premises, and those obstructions tend to be consumerism. And so I agree with like half of what he's saying, but then I'm not taking I don't necessarily agree, and I'm kind of concerned that there may be more and more of this reactionary sort of digs in this particular thing. So I'm gonna look at something else. I know Sagat.
There are experiments to show
is a really pro left wing ideology, or at least it seems to be more so.
Talked about before is this issue of.
Now it's just going. The stream is over, so or the stream playlist I made. Let's see if there's anything interesting on the YouTube straight up. I can't play music, or I'd play that Toby Ngugwe song. They're all that group is amazing. I forgot the name of the group, but whoa, the world's most mysterious book. That looks interesting.
Deep inside Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library lies the only copy of a 240-page tome. Recently carbon dated to around 1420, its vellum pages feature looping handwriting and hand-drawn images seemingly stolen from a dream. Real and imaginary plants, floating castles, bathing women, astrology diagrams, zodiac rings, and suns and moons with faces accompany the text. This 24 by 16 centimeter book is called the Voynich manuscript, and it's one of history's biggest unsolved mysteries. The reason why? No one can figure out what it says. The name comes from Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish bookseller who came across the document at a Jesuit college in Italy in 1912. He was puzzled. Who wrote it? Where was it made? What do these bizarre words and vibrant drawings represent? What secrets do its pages contain? He purchased the manuscript from the cash-strapped priest at the college and eventually brought it to the US, where experts have continued to puzzle over it for more than a century. Cryptologists say the writing has all the characteristics of a real language, just one that no one's ever seen before. What makes it seem real is that in actual languages, letters and groups of letters appear with consistent frequencies, and the language in the Voynich manuscript has patterns you wouldn't find from a random letter generator. Other than that, we know little more than what we can see. The letters are varied in style and height. Some are borrowed from other scripts, but many are unique. The taller letters have been named gallows characters. The manuscript is highly decorated throughout with scroll-like embellishments. It appears to be written by 2 or more hands, with the painting done by yet another party. Over the years, 3 main theories about the manuscript's text have emerged. The first is that it's written in cipher, a secret code deliberately designed to hide secret meaning. The second is that the document is a hoax, written in gibberish to make money off a gullible buyer. Some speculate the author was a medieval conman, others that it was Voynich himself. The third theory is that the manuscript is written in an actual language, but in an unknown script. Perhaps medieval scholars were attempting to create an alphabet for a language that was spoken, but not yet written. In that case, the Voynich manuscript might be like the Rongo script invented on Easter Island, now unreadable after the culture that made it collapsed. Though no one can read the Voynich manuscript, that hasn't stopped people from guessing what it might say. Those who believe the manuscript was an attempt to create a new form of written language speculate that it might be an encyclopedia containing the knowledge of the culture that produced it. Others believe it was written by the 13th century philosopher Roger Bacon, who attempted to understand the universal laws of grammar, or in the 16th century by the Elizabethan mystic John Dee, who practiced alchemy and divination. More fringe theories hold that the book was written by a coven of Italian witches, or even by Martians. After 100 years of frustration, scientists have recently shed a little light on the mystery. The first breakthrough was the carbon dating. Also, contemporary historians have traced the provenance of the manuscript back through Rome and Prague to as early as 1612, when it was perhaps passed from Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II to his physician Jacobus Sinapius. In addition to these historical breakthroughs, linguistic researchers recently proposed the provisional identification of a few of the manuscript's words. Could the letters beside these 7 stars spell Tarun, a name for Taurus, a constellation that includes the 7 stars called the Pleiades? Could this word be Centauron, for the centurion plant in the picture? Perhaps, but progress is slow. If we can crack its code, what might we find? The dream journal of a 15th century illustrator? A bunch of nonsense? Or the lost knowledge of a forgotten culture? What do you think it is?
Hey, thanks everybody for joining so far. I just watch videos. Sometimes I'll play video games. I might do VR. Sometimes I just let the stream run. Sometimes I raid a friend's channel when we have enough people on Twitch. It's JX01312 on Twitch. That's phonetic. It's not like the numbers or just the symbols, which it could be. And I have an account called that, but if you go find that, you're not going to find any videos. I just use that as my monitoring account, if that makes sense, on my other laptop. Anyway, I was going to watch Zeitgeist, because all this shit just reminded me of that movie, and that shit was good. And I think it's pretty much free on here, if I'm not mistaken. This seems to... Oh, you have to fucking pay for it. Of course you do. It's a good film. I don't think it would even let me watch the whole thing if I did pay for it. Alright, let's go to... see what else here. That seems interesting.
Scientists are testing to see if we are living in a simulation. Elon Musk is even funding work in this field, and he believes that there is a 1 in billions of a chance that we live in reality, but we are in a simulation. This video breaks down the science and math behind the simulation hypothesis. We also take a look at how much computer power is needed to simulate a universe. Would we need to build a structure around the sun to capture all of its energy to power such a computer? Is humanity being simulated as 2D beings to save on computer power that then gets projected in 3D? And could we create a simulation for humanity that allows us to travel further into outer space? If you think that simulations are possible, then it is almost certain that we are in one. People have been questioning for centuries what is the truth and what is an illusion. From Plato's allegory of the cave in the Western world to Zhuangzhu's butterfly dream in the East. Plato, who lived between 428 and 348 BC, tells the tale of people kept in a cave. They grow up only seeing the shadows of other people on a wall. For them, the shadows are the real world. One day, one of the cave people is taken outside. He sees how the outside world is much more real than the one in the cave. He comes back to the cave to free the others, but is now unable to see in the dark. The people inside the cave think it is dangerous outside and refuse to go. The cave represents people who believe that knowledge comes from what we see and hear in the world. Plato said that true knowledge comes from philosophical reasoning. Zhuangzhu, a Chinese philosopher who lived in the 4th century BC, dreamed that he was a butterfly. The butterfly did not know he was Zhuangzhu. Suddenly, he woke up and he was Zhuangzhu. But how can he be sure he is not a butterfly dreaming that he is a person? As both dreaming and waking feel real, how can we tell which one is true? Moving forward to 1977, Philip Kindred, who created the stories for Blade Runner and Minority Report, argued that we are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clues we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in reality occurs, such as when we have an overwhelming impression that we are living in the present, like déjà vu.
So yeah, I'm gonna watch that thing you sent me here in just a second, Jennifer. I'll get that up on the queue. I'm starting a new playlist here. Yeah, if anybody has any recommendations, I'm definitely down to play them.
Elon Musk is another person who questions our reality, using the development of video games as an example of why we are living in a simulation. Elon says that we are clearly on a trajectory to soon have video games that are indistinguishable from reality, and those games will be played on any console or PC, and there would probably be billions of such computers. Elon Musk wonders what the levels above us look like, saying that the simulation is probably running in a boring world, since when you take a video game or a movie, it is a condensed version of what is most interesting about life. Most likely, if we are in a simulation, it's very boring outside of the simulation, and the further down the number of simulations you go, the more interesting it becomes. So what is the likelihood that we are living in a simulation? Let's take a look at the science and math behind the theories. Working at the University of Oxford on existential risk, Dr. Nick Bostrom, whose work is helped funded by Elon Musk, created the foundational theory of the simulation argument. He presents three scenarios. 1. The human species will go extinct before creating a simulation of another universe. 2. Advanced civilizations that are capable of creating simulations are not interested in creating simulations of their evolutionary history or a variation of it. 3. The probability that we are living in a simulation is close to 1, as we are almost certainly living in a simulation. Dr. Bostrom says that since little is known, we must assume for now that each one has an equal likelihood. The book Superintelligence, Paths, Dangers, and Strategies by Dr. Nick Bostrom is one that Elon Musk highly recommends people to read. The link is in the description.
Fuck Elon Musk.
If we are able to create a simulation, then the chances that we are in one greatly increases. Let's explore why. When would it be possible for us to create a simulation? To figure this out, we just need to take a look at video games and predict how soon in the future we could be playing and living in virtual worlds that people can't tell the difference from the real one. Elon Musk says that we have gone from playing Pong, which is 2 blocks and a dot, to today's hyper-realistic games with millions of players, and all of this took place in just the last 50 years. He adds that even if the rate of video game advancement drops by 1,000 from what it is today, then imagine it is 10,000 years in the future when we will have simulations, which is nothing on the evolutionary scale. But humanity will reach a point sooner than that, when the growth of technology becomes uncontrollable, and then human civilization will change in ways that we cannot predict. We will be able to create powerful video game simulations that even the artificial intelligence living within them will feel like the simulation is their reality. And the artificial intelligence would also create games and virtual worlds, designing multiple layers of simulations. There could be hundreds, thousands, or a million simulated universes. And if only one of the million universes is the real world, the base reality, then the probability that we are in the base reality is 1 in a million. So if we as humans are able to create a simulation, then the likelihood that we are in one increases. Elon Musk says that the odds that we are in the base reality is more like 1 in billions. Dr. David Kipping, an astronomer, has broken it down into 2 possibilities. Either there are no simulations, or there are many simulated realities and 1 base reality. In mathematics, when there is no information to decide the likelihood of something being true, each is considered equally likely. This is known as the principle of indifference. So in this case, there is a 50% chance that there are no simulations and a 50% chance there are. But even if number 2 is true, that there are many simulations and one base reality, there is still the possibility that we are in the base reality and are the first civilization to create a simulation. This means that the probability of us living in the real world, the base reality, is now slightly higher. People like Elon Musk believe and predict based on the development of video games that we will one day be capable of creating simulations. If we do create a simulation containing conscious beings, then the statistics will flip, and most of the arguments against the possibility of us living in a simulation will fail. And we will most certainly be living in a simulation ourselves. Coming up next, the scientists working on proving whether we are in a simulation, the arguments for why we are not in a simulation, and the costs to create a computer powerful enough to run a simulation of the universe. Is it possible to test whether we are living in a simulation? Work is being done to test if the simulation theory is true. Here are 3 ways that scientists are testing to see if we are living in a simulation. The tests come from the idea that the simulation we are living in is run on a computer with a limited amount of computational power, just like a normal computer, and that there could be some subtle bugs in the simulation, just like in a video game. If we could detect these, this could point towards the fact that we are living in a simulation. NASA engineer Thomas Campbell and his colleagues are trying to test if the simulation is only rendering what we can see, as the simulation would not simulate everything at once as a way to save computing resources. Much like in video games today, it is the technological version of the philosophical idea called solipsism. Thomas Campbell and his colleagues have designed a quantum physics experiment, one that uses a sequence of mirrors, lasers, and slits. They believe that if the universe is a simulation that only simulates what we are looking at, then the light should behave abnormally and clearly show if we are in a simulation. Another test comes from the fact that as the simulation is running, it may accumulate errors over time. The simulators would correct the errors by modifying the laws of nature. However, no drift has been observed in the physical constants over many decades. Maybe our measurements are not accurate enough, or the modifications happen over extended periods of time beyond humanity's history. Another scientific experiment being set up to test if we are in a simulation comes from Silas Bean, a nuclear physicist from the University of Washington. He proposes that we could find the limited resolution at which the universe is rendered. Space-time is the mathematical model which combines the 3 dimensions of space, length, width, and depth, with the dimension of time. When physicists simulate small parts of space-time, they break up the universe into a grid-like lattice and simulate small chunks at a time. Silas Bean and his team look at cosmic rays as visible light. He argues that if the simulation is broken down into a grid, then these high-energy cosmic rays will have energies that vary in different directions. So if we can observe this, then we can prove that we are in a simulation. The next step is to see what happens when real-world cosmic rays hit their instrument. But cosmic rays only hit a square kilometer of Earth once every 100 years, so this will take some time to prove. While some people believe that we are in a simulation, others argue that this is not true. William Poundstone, who wrote the book called The Doomsday Calculation, the link is in the description, points out a potential hole in the simulation argument. When we make books, movies, or video games, they are usually made within a few hundred years of our current day. William argues that a simulation would be close in time to that of the simulator's world. In this case, our simulation should have widespread simulation technology and be in a futuristic era. As we do not have this technology, we would be more of an ancient civilization and be an unlikely choice for a simulation. But others argue that this is making assumptions about what an advanced civilization would do with simulation technology. They may have completely different preferences to our own. And there is no indication that this universe was created for us. It could just be artifacts and byproducts in a simulation that was made to test some hypothetical scenario. Another argument comes from cosmologist Sean Carroll. If simulations are possible, then civilizations living in them will be able to create more simulations. There could be thousands of layers, and the deeper you go, the more simulations there are. So statistically, the largest number of simulations and simulated people are in the deepest layer. But each simulation has to be less complex than the universe above it, because the computer power will decrease every time a new layer is created, since the level above has to compute it along with the simulations below the simulations. Therefore, there is a limit, a floor, to how deep you can go. The civilization at the lowest stage will not be able to create simulations because there are no more resources available. If the simulation hypothesis is correct and there are multiple levels, then we are certainly at the lowest level and we may not be able to create simulations. If we can't create a simulated universe, how do we know if a universe could ever be simulated? This is called the Carroll's contradiction. Many say that this is not a contradiction, and that we can in fact be both in a simulation and unable to simulate a universe ourselves. Let's take a look into the future. Silas Bean, the nuclear physicist trying to test if we are in a simulation, believes that we will be able to simulate the entire universe within 500 years. In reality, we will likely continue to do what we do with video games, which is to only simulate the parts of the universe that the players are currently looking at. This would mean that we could simulate an entire universe much sooner, depending on the number of simulated people within the universe. Nick Bostrom says that scientists consider the number of operations per second to replicate a human brain to be between 10 to the power of 14 and 10 to the power of 17, with additional computing power added to simulate the environment. Computers today can do over 10 to the power of 9 operations per second. To save computing power, it is possible that everything is simulated in 2D, making you a 2D person. And everything is then projected in 3D, just like 3D movie screens or holograms. Bostrom adds that we can evaluate the cost to create a realistic simulation of all of human history to be between 10 to the power of 33 and 10 to the power of 36 operations per second. R.J. Bradbury, in his paper Matryoshka Brains, estimates that a computer with a mass of a large planet could process 10 to the power of 42 operations per second. To power such a computer, a Dyson sphere would be required, which is a structure that is built around a star, such as our Sun, to capture all of its energy. Would such a powerful computer allow humanity to transfer its consciousness into a simulation, letting us travel further into space? This is something that we talk more about in our time-lapse of future tech video. The link is in the description. On the next episode of Venture City, we take a look at the robots working at Tesla. Hit the subscribe and thumbs up buttons to not miss a video.
This is a video about things like cars, phones, the Great Depression in the 19th.
Sorry, I hid my cursor, so it's difficult for me to know exactly where to click. All right, trigger warning for this one. Thanks for sharing it with me. All right, this is 3 hours.
We live in a strange time. Extraordinary events keep happening that undermine the stability of our world. Suicide bombs, waves of refugees, Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, even Brexit. yet those in control seem unable to deal with them. And no one has any vision of a different or a better kind of future. This film will tell the story of how we got to this strange place. It is about how over the past 40 years, politicians, financiers and technological utopians, rather than face up to the real complexities of the world, retreated. Instead, they constructed a simpler version of the world in order to hang on to power. And as this fake world grew, all of us went along with it, because the simplicity was reassuring. Even those who thought they were attacking the system, the radicals, the artists, the musicians, and our whole counterculture, actually became part of the trickery. Because they too had retreated into the make-believe world. Which is why their opposition has no effect, and nothing ever changes. But this retreat into a dream world allowed dark and destructive forces to fester and grow outside. Forces that are now returning to pierce the fragile surface of our carefully constructed fake world. The story begins in two cities at the same moment in 1975. One is New York, the other is Damascus. It was a moment when two ideas about how it might be possible to run the world without politics first took hold. In 1975, New York City was on the verge of collapse. For 30 years, the politicians who ran the city had borrowed more and more money from the banks to pay for its growing services and welfare. But in the early 70s, the middle classes fled from the city, and the taxes they paid disappeared with them. So the banks lent the city even more. But then they began to get worried about the size of the growing debt, and whether the city would ever be able to pay it back. And then one day in 1975, the banks just stopped. The city held its regular meeting to issue bonds in return for the loans, overseen by the city's financial controller.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today, the City of New York is offering for competitive bidding sale 260 million tax anticipation notes, of which 100 million will mature on June 3rd, 1975.
The banks were supposed to turn up at 11 a.m. But it soon became clear that none of them were going to appear. The meeting was rescheduled for 2 p.m. and the banks promised they would turn up.
The announcement on behalf of the controller is that the offer, which we had expected to receive and announce at 2 o'clock this afternoon,
my friend showed me this,
is now expected at 4 o'clock.
Well, does this mean that so far nobody wants those bonds?
We will be making a further announcement at 4 o'clock, and anything further that I could say now I think would not advance the interests of the sale, which is now in progress.
Does this mean that you have not been able to sell them so far today?
We will have a further announcement at 4 o'clock.
What happened that day in New York marked a radical shift in power. The banks insisted that in order to protect their loans, they should be allowed to take control of the city. The city appealed to the president, but he refused to help. So a new committee was set up to manage the city's finances. Out of 9 members, 8 of them were bankers. It was the start of an extraordinary experiment where the financial institutions took power away from the politicians and started to run society themselves. The city had no other option. The bankers enforced what was called austerity on the city, insisting that thousands of teachers, policemen and firemen were sacked. This was a new kind of politics. The old politicians believed that crises were solved through negotiations and deals. The bankers had a completely different view. They were just the representatives of something that couldn't be negotiated with, the logic of the market. To them, there was no alternative to this system. It should run society.
Just by shifting paper around, these slobs can make $60–65 million in a single transaction. That would take care of all of the layoffs in the city. So it's reckless, it's cruel, and it's a disgrace.
There'd be a fair number of bankers, of course, who'd say, well, it's the unions who have been too greedy. Now, what would your reaction be to that?
I guess they're right in a way. If you can make $60 million on a single transaction and a worker makes $8–9,000 a year, I suppose they're correct, and as they go back to their little estates in Greenwich, Connecticut, I want to wish them well, the slobs.
But the extraordinary thing was, no one opposed the bankers. The radicals and the left-wingers, who 10 years before had dreamt of changing America through revolution, did nothing. They had retreated and were living in the abandoned buildings in Manhattan.
Damn.
The singer Patti Smith later described the mood of disillusion that had come over them. I could not identify with the political movements any longer, she said. All the manic activity in the streets. In trying to join them, I felt overwhelmed by yet another form of bureaucracy. What she was describing was the rise of a new, powerful individualism that could not fit with the idea of collective political action. Instead, Patti Smith and many others became a new kind of individual radical who watched the decaying city with a cool detachment. They didn't try and change it. They just experienced it.
Look at that. Isn't that cool? I love that where like kids write all over the walls. That to me is neater than any art sometimes. Jose and Maria forever. Oh, there's a lot of things like when you pass by big movie houses, maybe we'll find one, but they have little movie screens where you can see clips of like Z or something like that. People watch it over and over. I've seen people, I've checked them out all day. I've gone back and forth and they're still there watching the credits of a movie because they don't have enough dough, but it's some entertainment, you know.
Instead, radicals across America turned to art and music as a means of expressing their criticism of society. They believed that instead of trying to change the world outside, the new radicalism should try and change what was inside people's heads. And the way to do this was through self-expression, not collective action.
U V W X Y Z.
But some of the left saw that something else was really going on. That by detaching themselves and retreating into an ironic coolness, a whole generation were beginning to lose touch with the reality of power. One of them wrote of that time, "It was the mood of the era, and the revolution was deferred indefinitely. And while we were dozing, the money crept in."
What's your date of birth, Larry?
But one of the people who did understand how to use this new power was Donald Trump. Trump realized that there was now no future in building housing for ordinary people because all the government grants had gone. But he saw that there were other ways to get vast amounts of money out of the state. Trump started to buy up derelict buildings in New York, and he announced that he was going to transform them into luxury hotels and apartments. But in return, he negotiated the biggest tax break in New York's history, worth $160 million. The city had to agree because they were desperate. And the banks, seeing a new opportunity, also started to lend him money. And Donald Trump began to transform New York into a city for the rich, while he paid practically nothing. At the very same time, in 1975, there was a confrontation between two powerful men in Damascus, the capital of Syria. One was Henry Kissinger, the US Secretary of State.
Also a dick.
The other was the president of Syria, Hafez al-Assad. The battle between the two men was going to have profound consequences for the world.
Not a fan of...
And like in New York, it was going to be a struggle between the old idea of using politics to change the world and a new idea that you could run the world as a stable system. President Assad dominated Syria. The country was full of giant images and statues that glorified him. He was brutal and ruthless, killing or imprisoning anyone he suspected of being a threat. But Assad believed that the violence was for a purpose. He wanted to find a way of uniting the Arab countries and using that power to stand up to the West.
Well, okay, that.
3,
Killing part.
2, 1.
Kissinger was also tough and ruthless. He had started in the 1950s as an expert in the theory of nuclear strategy, what was called the delicate balance of terror. It was the system that ran the Cold War. Both sides believed that if they attacked, the other side would immediately launch their missiles and everyone would be annihilated. Kissinger had been one of the models for the character of Dr. Strangelove in Stanley Kubrick's film.
Mr. President,
This is a great film.
I would not rule out the chance to preserve a nucleus of human specimens. It will be quite easy. At the bottom of some of our deeper minds,
Henry was not a warm, friendly, modest, jovial sort of person. He was thought of as one of the more anxious, temperamental, self-conscious, ambitious, inconsiderate people at Harvard.
Kissinger saw himself as a hard realist. He had no time for the emotional turmoil of political ideologies. He believed that history had always really been a struggle for power between groups and nations. But what Kissinger took from the Cold War was a way of seeing the world as an interconnected system. And his aim was to keep that system in balance and prevent it from falling into chaos.
I believe that with all the dislocations we now experience, there also exists an extraordinary opportunity to form for the first time in history a truly global society carried by the principle of interdependence. And if we act wisely and with vision, I think we can look back to all this turmoil as the birth pangs of a more creative and better system. If we miss the opportunity, I think there's going to be chaos.
The flight has been delayed, we understand now. The Kissinger will be arriving here about an hour and a half from now. So we'll just get have the press informed, and then we'll stay in contact with you.
And it was this idea that Kissinger set out to impose on the chaotic politics of the Middle East. But to manage it, he knew that he was going to have to deal with President Assad of Syria. President Assad was convinced that there would only ever be a real and lasting peace between the Arabs and Israel if the Palestinian refugees were allowed to return to their homeland. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were living in exile in Syria, as well as in the Lebanon and Jordan.
Have you found that the Palestinians here want to integrate with the Syrians at all?
Oh, no, never. They don't want, not here or neither in Lebanon or in Jordan, never. No, because they want to stay as a whole, as a Palestinian. They call themselves those who go back, al-Aidun in Arabic.
Assad also believed that such a peace would strengthen the Arab world. But Kissinger thought that strengthening the Arabs would destabilize his balance of power. So he set out to do the very opposite, to fracture the power of the Arab countries by dividing them and breaking their alliances so they would keep each other in check. Kissinger now played a double game, or as he termed it, constructive ambiguity. In a series of meetings, he persuaded Egypt to sign a separate agreement with Israel. But at the same time, he led Assad to believe that he was working for a wider peace agreement, one that would include the Palestinians. In reality, the Palestinians were ignored. They were irrelevant to the structural balance of the global system.
The hallmark of Kissinger's thinking about international politics is its structural design. Everything is always connected in his mind to everything else. But his first thoughts are on that level, on this structural global balance of power level. And as he addresses questions of human dignity, human survival, human freedom, I think they tend to come into his mind as an adjunct of the play of nations at the power game.
When Assad found out the truth, it was too late. In a series of confrontations with Kissinger in Damascus, Assad raged about this treachery. He told Kissinger that what he had done would release demons hidden under the surface of the Arab world. Kissinger described their meetings. Assad's controlled fury, he wrote, was all the more impressive for its eerily cold, seemingly unemotional demeanor. Assad now retreated. He started to build a giant palace that loomed over Damascus, and his belief that it would be possible to transform the Arab world began to fade. A British journalist who knew Assad wrote, "Assad's optimism has gone. A trust in the future has gone. What has emerged instead is a brutal, vengeful Assad, who believes in nothing except revenge." The original dream of the Soviet Union had been to create a glorious new world. A world where not only the society, but the people themselves would be transformed. They would become new and better kinds of human beings. But by the 1980s, it was clear that the dream had failed. The Soviet Union became instead a society where no one believed in anything or had any vision of the future.
А если у вас было желание, какое вы смотрели, вы выразить сейчас?
Чего?
Желание, если у вас есть, например, какое у вас было бы сейчас?
Чего?
Желание, мечта.
Мечта?
Да.
Ну, как вам сказать? Не знаю даже, что вам сказать. Мечта. Раньше не желая, не гадая, ничего не выйдет все равно.
Нет, ну
Я мечтала и гадала, а у меня все наоборот идет. И теперь не верю и никогда не буду думать и мечтать.
А вы верите?
Кому?
Что?
Кому верить?
Ну, не знаю, Богу.
Богу? Никому не верю, ничего не верю. И вам тоже не верю.
Ну, у тебя очень странная прическа. Где тебя так красиво подстригли?
Знакомилась с панками московскими, а меня подстригли.
А что это за течение-то, панки?
Ну, это люди, которые любят свободу, там, терпят насилие, там, и так далее.
А ты не свободна, да?
Свободно.
Ну, мне кажется, у тебя что-то случилось.
Да, у меня ничего не случилось. Ну, у меня ничего не случилось.
Ну, ясно. Потом тогда расскажешь. Потом, я понимаю, что тебе сейчас трудно говорить. В следующий раз расскажешь.
Я повторяю 10 раз и снова. Никто не знает, как же мне хуёво. И телевизор с потолка свисает. И как хуёво мне никто не знает. Все это до того подзаебало, что хочется опять начать сначала. Куплет печальный, он такой, что снова я повторяю, как же мне хуёво.
Those who ran the Soviet Union had believed that they could plan and manage a new kind of socialist society. But they had discovered that it was impossible to control and predict everything, and the plan had run out of control. But rather than reveal this, the technocrats began to pretend that everything was still going according to plan. And what emerged instead was a fake version of the society. The Soviet Union became a society where everyone knew that what their leaders said was not real, because they could see with their own eyes that the economy was falling apart. But everybody had to play along and pretend that it was real, because no one could imagine any alternative. One Soviet writer called it hyper-normalization. You were so much a part of the system that it was impossible to see beyond it. The fakeness was hyper-normal. In this stagnant world, two brothers called Arkady and Boris Strugatsky became the inspiration of a growing new dissident movement. They weren't politicians. They were science fiction writers. And in their stories, they expressed the strange mood that was rising up as the Soviet Empire collapsed. Their most famous book was called Roadside Picnic. It is set in a world that seems like the present, except there is a zone that has been created by an alien force. People known as stalkers go into the zone. They find that nothing is what it seems, that reality changes minute by minute. Shadows go the wrong way. There are hidden forces that twist your body and change the way you think and feel. The picture the Strugatskys gave was of a world where nothing was fixed, where reality, both what you saw and what you believed had become shifting and unstable. And in 1979, the film director Andrei Tarkovsky made a film that was based on Roadside Picnic. He called it Stalker.
Что случилось? Зачем вы меня остановили?
Я вас не останавливал.
А кто? Вы? Черт его знает.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States. That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
The new President of America had a new vision of the world. It wasn't the harsh realism of Henry Kissinger any longer. It was different. It was a simple, moral crusade, where America had a special destiny to fight evil and to make the world a better place.
The places and the periods in which man has known freedom are few and far between, just scattered moments on the span of time. And most of those moments have been ours. The American people have a genius for great and unselfish deeds. Into the hands of America, God has placed the destiny of an afflicted mankind. God bless America.
But this crusade was going to lead Reagan to come face to face with Henry Kissinger's legacy. And above all, the vengeful fury of President Assad of Syria. Israel was now determined to finally destroy the power of the Palestinians. And in 1982, they sent a massive army to encircle the Palestinian camps in the Lebanon.
Do you know how strong the Israelis are? Do you know how many tanks they have outside Beirut? Do you know how strong they are?
يعني بيقول انه احنا بنعرف انه الاسرائيليين اقوياء، فهل هذا بيأثر علينا؟
اسرائيل وامريكا وكل دول العالم ما بتأثر علينا طول ما سلاحنا بايدنا، ولا اي دولة في العالم تقدر تحاربنا.
We are not ready to surrender.
طول ما هو الشعب رافع راسه والشعب معنا ما حدا بيقدرنا.
طلع شاب يانج لسه بيبل اولاد صغار على الحرب.
Dash into this building here because the PLO guys will expect that sooner or later there will be a huge explosion. There have been several of these in the last few minutes. As you can see, there's enormous damage in all the buildings around here.
Quick.
2 months later, thousands of Palestinian refugees were massacred in the camps. It horrified the world. But what was even more shocking was that Israel had allowed it to happen. Its troops had stood by and watched as a Christian Lebanese faction murdered the Palestinians.
This was the first of the massacres we discovered yesterday. Now, 24 hours later, the stench here is appalling. But the effects on the Israelis of what their Christian allies did here and in dozens of other places around this camp are going to be immense. There's always been a risk of such massacres if Christian militiamen were allowed to come into Palestinian camps, and the Israelis seem to have done nothing to prevent them coming into this one.
In the face of the horror and the growing chaos, President Reagan was forced to act. He announced that American Marines would come to Beirut to lead a peacekeeping force. Reagan insisted that the troops were neutral, but President Assad was convinced that there was another reality. He saw the troops as part of the growing conspiracy between America and Israel to divide the Middle East into factions and destroy the power of the Arabs. Assad decided to get the Americans out of the Middle East. And to do this, he made an alliance with the new revolutionary force of Ayatollah Khomeini's Iran. And what Khomeini could bring to Assad was an extraordinary new weapon that he had just created. It was called the poor man's atomic bomb. Ayatollah Khomeini had come to power 2 years before as the leader of the Iranian Revolution. But his hold on power was precarious. And Khomeini had developed a new idea of how to fight his enemies and defend the revolution. Khomeini told his followers that they could destroy themselves in order to save the revolution, providing that in the process they killed as many enemies around them as possible. This was completely new, because the Quran specifically prohibited suicide. In the past, you became a martyr on the battlefield because God chose the time and place of your death. But Khomeini changed this. He did it by going back to one of the central rituals of Shia Islam. Every year, Shiites march in a procession, mourning the sacrifice of their founder, Hussein. As they do, they whip themselves, symbolically reenacting Hussein's suffering. Khomeini said that the ultimate act of penitence was not just to whip yourself, but to kill yourself, providing it was for the greater good of the revolution.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, good afternoon. An Iraqi Soviet-made MiG-23 was shot down by the Air Force jet fighters of the Islamic Republic over the northwestern Iranian border region of Marivan at 10:08 hours local time Saturday, said the Joint Staff Command's communique numbered 1710.
Khomeini had mobilized this force when the country was attacked by Iraq. Iran faced almost certain defeat because Iraq had far superior weapons, many of them supplied by America. So the revolutionaries took tens of thousands of young boys out of schools, put them on buses, and sent them to the front line. Their job was to walk through the enemy's minefields, deliberately blowing themselves up in order to open gaps that would allow the Iranian army to pass through unharmed. It was organized suicide on a vast scale. This human sacrifice was commemorated in giant cemeteries across the country. Fountains flowing with blood-red water glorified this new kind of martyrdom. It was this new idea of an unstoppable human weapon that President Assad took from Khomeini and brought to the West for the first time. But as it traveled, it would mutate into something even more deadly. Instead of just killing yourself, you would take explosives with you into the heart of the enemy, and then blow yourself up taking dozens or even hundreds along with you. It would become known as suicide bombing. In October 1983, 2 suicide bombers drove trucks into the US Marine barracks in Beirut.
It was seeing something move that took me out of my trance. And then I recognized, oh yes, Marines were in that building. A lot of Marines were in that building. And that's when I ran down, and it was a black Marine. He looked white. The dust, it just covered him.
The massive explosions killed 241 Americans. The bombers were members of a new militant group that no one had heard of. They called themselves Hezbollah, and although many of them were Iranian, they were very much under the control of Syria and the Syrian intelligence agencies. President Assad was using them as his proxies to attack America.
Whoever carried out yesterday's bombings, Shia Muslim fanatics, devotees of the Ayatollah Khomeini, or whatever, it is Syria who profits politically. The most significant fact is that the dissidents live and work with Syrian protection. So it is to Syria, rather than to the dissident group's guiding light, Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran, that we must look for an explanation of the group's activities. Destabilization is Syria's Middle Eastern way of reminding the world that Syria must not be left out of plans for the future of the area.
There are no words that can express our sorrow and grief over the loss of those splendid young men and the injury to so many others. But these deeds make so evident the bestial nature of those who would assume power if they could have their way and drive us out of that area.
But despite his words, within 4 months, President Reagan withdrew all the American troops from the Lebanon. The Secretary of State, George Shultz, explained, "We became paralyzed by the complexity that we faced," he said. So the Americans turned and left. For President Assad, it was an extraordinary achievement. He was the only Arab leader to have defeated the Americans and forced them to leave the Middle East. He had done it by using the new force of suicide bombing, a force that once unleashed was going to spread with unstoppable power. But at this point, both Assad and the Iranians thought that they could control it. And what gave it this extraordinary power was that it held out the dream of transcending the corruptions of the world and entering a new and better realm.
One should defend the realm of Islam and Muslims against heretics and invaders. And to fulfill this duty, one should even sacrifice one's life. We believe that martyrs can overlook our deeds from the other world. It means that after death, the martyr lives and can still witness this world.
By the middle of the 1980s, the banks were rising up and becoming ever more powerful in America. What had started 10 years before in New York, the idea that the financial system could run society, was spreading. But unlike older systems of power, it was mostly invisible. A writer called William Gibson tried to dramatize what was happening in a powerful, imaginative way in a series of novels. Gibson had noticed how the banks and the new corporations were beginning to link themselves together through computer systems. What they were creating was a series of giant networks of information that were invisible to ordinary people and to politicians. But those networks gave the corporations extraordinary new powers of control.
Development, may I help you?
Gibson gave this new world a name. He called it cyberspace, and his novels described a future that was dangerous and frightening. Hackers could literally enter into cyberspace, and as they did, they travelled through systems that were so powerful that they could reach out and crush intruders by destroying their minds. In cyberspace, there were no laws and no politicians to protect you. Just raw, brutal, corporate power. But then, a strange thing happened. A new group of visionaries in America took Gibson's idea of a hidden, secret world and transformed it into something completely different. They turned it into a dream of a new utopia. They were the technological utopians who were rising up on the west coast of America. They turned Gibson's idea on its head. Instead of cyberspace being a frightening place dominated by powerful corporations, they reinvented it as the very opposite. A new, safe world where radical dreams could come true. 10 years before, faced by the complexity of real politics, the radicals had given up on the idea of changing the world. But now, the computer utopians saw in cyberspace an alternative reality, a place they could retreat to, away from the harsh right-wing politics that now dominated Reagan's America. The roots of this vision lay back in the counterculture of the 1960s, and above all, with LSD.
We've got some more acid over here if you want to go ahead and drop it.
Many of those who had taken LSD in the 60s were convinced that it was more than just another drug, that it opened human perception and allowed people to see new realities that were normally hidden from them.
See, the ones that have white in them are really great. Like a rabbit.
It freed them from the narrow, limited view of the world that was imposed on them by politicians and those in power.
In the United States, in the next 5, 10, 15 years, you're going to see more and more people taking LSD and making it a part of their lives, so there will be an LSD country within 15 years. An LSD society, there'll be less interest in, obviously, warfare, in power politics. You know, politics today is a disease. That's a real addiction. Politics, 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 politics. Don't politic. Don't vote. These are old men's games. Impotent and senile old men that want to put you onto their old chess games of war and power.
20 years later, the new networks of machines seemed to offer a way to construct a real alternate reality. Not just one that was chemically induced, but a space that actually existed in a parallel dimension to the real world. And like with acid, cyberspace could be a place where you would be liberated from the old corrupt hierarchies of politics and power and explore new ways of being. One of the leading exponents of this idea was called John Perry Barlow. In the 60s, he had written songs for the Grateful Dead and been part of the acid counterculture. Now, he organised what he called cyberthons to try and bring the cyberspace movement together.
Well, you know, the Cyberthon, as it was originally conceived, was supposed to be the 90s equivalent of the acid test. And we had thought to involve some of the same personnel.
You and I and Timmy should sit down and talk.
Okay, that's good.
And it immediately acquired a financial quality, or commercial quality, that was initially a little unsettling to an old hippie like me, but as soon as I saw it actually working, then I thought, well, if you're going to have an acid test for the 90s, money better be involved.
Instead of having a glass barrier that separates your mind, from the mind of the computer pulls us inside and creates a world for us.
Incorporates everything that could be incorporated. It incorporates experience itself.
Barlow then wrote a manifesto that he called a Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. It was addressed to all politicians, telling them to keep out of this new world. It was going to be incredibly influential, because what Barlow did was give a powerful picture of the internet, not as a network controlled by giant corporations, but instead as a kind of magical, free place, an alternative to the old systems of power. It was a vision that would come to dominate the internet over the next 20 years.
Governments of the industrial world, cyberspace does not lie within your borders. We are creating a world where anyone, anywhere, may express his or her beliefs, no matter how singular, without fear of being coerced into silence or conformity. I declare the global social space we are building to be naturally independent of the tyrannies you seek to impose on us. We will create a civilization of the mind in cyberspace. May it be more humane and fair than the world your governments have made before.
It's begun. This is the key to a new order. This code disk means freedom.
But two young hackers in New York thought that Barlow was describing a fantasy world, that his vision bore no relationship at all to what was really emerging online. They were cult figures on the early online scene, and their fans followed and recorded them. They called themselves Fiber Optic and Acid Freak, and they spent their time exploring and breaking into giant computer networks that they knew were the hard realities of modern digital power.
My specific instance, I was charged with conspiracy to commit a few dozen overt acts, they called them, among a number of things having to do with computer trespass and I guess computer eavesdropping, interception, unauthorized access to federal interest computers, which is a pretty vague law, communications network computers and so on.
In a notorious public debate online, the two hackers attacked Barlow. What infuriated them most was Barlow's insistence that there was no hierarchy or controlling powers in the new cyber world. The hackers set out to demonstrate that he was wrong. Acid Freak hacked into the computers of a giant corporation called TRW. TRW had originally built the systems that ran the Cold War for the US military. They had helped create the delicate balance of terror. Now, TRW had adapted their computers to run a new system, that of credit and debt. Their computers gathered up the credit data of millions of Americans and were being used by the banks to decide individuals' credit ratings. The hackers broke into the TRW network, stole Barlow's credit history, and published it online. The hackers were demonstrating the growing power of finance, how the companies that ran the new systems of credit knew more and more about you, and increasingly used that information to control your destiny. And the system that was allowing this to happen were the new giant networks of information connected through computer servers. The hackers were questioning whether Barlow's utopian rhetoric about cyberspace might really be a convenient camouflage, hiding the emergence of a new and growing power that was way beyond politics. But cyberspace was not the only imaginary story being created. Faced with the humiliating defeat in the Lebanon, President Reagan's government was desperate to shore up the vision of a moral world where a good America struggled against evil. And to do this, they were going to create a simple villain, an imaginary enemy, one that would free them from the paralyzing complexity of real Middle Eastern politics. And the perfect candidate was waiting in the wings. Colonel Gaddafi, the ruler of Libya. The Americans were going to ruthlessly use Colonel Gaddafi to create a fake terrorist mastermind. And Gaddafi was going to happily play along, because it would turn him into a famous global figure. Colonel Gaddafi had taken power in a coup in the 1970s. But from the very start, he was convinced that he was more than just the leader of one country. He believed that he was an international revolutionary whose destiny was to challenge the power of the West.
Gentlemen, the Queen.
When he was a young officer, Gaddafi had been sent to England for training. And he had detested the patronising racism that he said he had found at the heart of British society.
Yes, I attended a course. I have been in England since 1966, from April to August.
You had the best months?
I was in Beaconsfield, a village called Beaconsfield, in Army School. In fact, we ill-treated in that place from some British officers. I think those officers were Jews, maybe Jews.
But ill-treated in what sort of way?
In many ways. They ill-treat us every time.
By being rude or by being bullying or?
In their all behavior towards us, they ill-treat us. They hate us anyhow because of colonization. It is a result of colonialism.
Once in power, Gaddafi had developed his own revolutionary theory, which he called the Third Universal Theory. It was an alternative, he said, to communism and capitalism. He published it in a green book, but practically no one read it. He had sent money and weapons to the IRA in Ireland to help them overthrow the British ruling class. But all the other Arab leaders rejected him and his ideas. They thought that he was mad. And by the mid-1980s, Gaddafi was an isolated figure, with no friends and no global influence. Then suddenly that changed. In December 1985, terrorists attacked Rome and Vienna airports simultaneously, killing 19 people, including 5 Americans. There was growing pressure on President Reagan to retaliate.
It's time to rename your State Department the Capitulation Department. Get off of your stick, Mr. President. The American people are sick and tired of being kicked around. You talk tough. Let's see you use some of these billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of weapons that you've asked us to approve. Your words are cheap talk.
President Reagan immediately announced that Colonel Gaddafi was definitely behind the attacks.
These murderers could not carry out their crimes without the sanctuary and support provided by regimes such as Colonel Gaddafi's in Libya. The Rome and Vienna murders are only the latest in a series of brutal terrorist acts committed with Gaddafi's backing.
But the European security services who investigated the attacks were convinced that Libya was not involved at all, and that the mastermind behind the attacks was in fact Syria, that the terrorists had been directed by the Syrian intelligence agencies.
But the Americans say that the attack at Rome airport was organized by Gaddafi, not by Damascus.
No,
what do you say?
We don't have any evidence.
You have no evidence
supporting such affirmation. The only evidence we have shows a Syrian connection.
Do you say that it was Libya, and the president said the evidence of Libya's culpability was irrefutable?
Yeah.
But the Italian authorities to whom I've spoken say emphatically on the record that their investigations have shown that it was entirely masterminded by Syria.
I don't agree with that at all.
Well, they've interrogated the surviving terrorists.
I must just say I don't agree with that.
But you've no evidence that Libya was in on the planning either.
Our evidence on Libya is circumstantial but very strong.
But why does the president then say it's irrefutable if you call it circumstantial?
Well, people can be convicted and sentenced in our courts on circumstantial evidence.
But what made it even more confusing was that although there seemed to be no evidence that Gaddafi had been behind the attacks, he made no attempt to deny the allegations. Instead, he went the other way and turned the crisis into a global drama.
It is not a time of saying, it is a time of work, time of confrontation.
Threatening suicide attacks against America.
This hostile position cannot be explained in racist and crusade terms. Suicidal attacks will have to be an answer to a military attack. But Libya is not affected by such measures that Reagan has declared. Stinking, rotten crusader.
Gaddafi now started to play a role that was going to become very familiar. He grabbed the publicity that had been given to him by the Americans and used it dramatically. He promoted himself as an international revolutionary who would help to liberate oppressed peoples around the world, even the blacks in America. Gaddafi arranged for a live satellite link to a mass meeting of the Nation of Islam in Chicago.
Brothers and sisters, it is with great honor and privilege that I present to you the leader of the Al-Fatah revolution from Libya, our brother Muammar al-Gaddafi.
Gaddafi told them that Libya was now their ally in their struggle against white America.
And to express my full support and support of my country to your struggle for freedom, for emancipation.
Gaddafi promised that he would supply weapons to create a black army in America of 400,000 men. If white America refuses to accept blacks as US citizens, he told them, it must therefore be destroyed. Gaddafi also invited a group of German rocket scientists to come to Libya to build him a rocket. He insisted it had no military purpose. Libya was now going to explore outer space.
I think it is peaceful and civilian activity for investigation of space and something like this. And it has nothing to do with any military things.
But no one believed him. Journalists warned that Gaddafi was really preparing to attack Europe, vividly dramatizing the new danger.
That is something like this, which goes that way to put something into space. But the same device, tilted, say, to an angle of 45 degrees, could, of course, become something very different. A missile possibly carrying a warhead. That would put Libya within range of an enormous area. A chilling proposition with its range of 2,000 kilometers.
The Americans and Gaddafi now became locked together in a cycle of mutual reinforcement. In the process, a powerful new image was created that was going to capture the imagination of the West. Gaddafi became a global supervillain, at the head of what was called a rogue state, a madman who threatened the stability of the world. And Gaddafi was loving every minute of it.
Does he think in the past his decisions sometimes have been taken too quickly?
Maybe.
On world affairs?
Maybe.
I think sometimes that is what has made people in the world nervous of you, perhaps.
Then there was another terrorist attack at a discotheque in West Berlin. A bomb killed an American soldier and injured hundreds.